Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this next video from the series called Implementing Secure Applications with Microsoft Azure. In this video, we are going to discover how to securely access data in Azure SQL database with Managed Identities. As always, let's start with the solution architecture diagram. So to understand the context we are going to discuss in this video. So in this video, we will see how to access SQL database from document API using managed identities. So this topic generates a lot of confusion, especially for developers, how to properly and securely communicate with Azure SQL database, because obviously we could use connection string with username and password. However, it's less secure method. So that's why in this video, I would like to present how to use a better, more secure approach to connect to SQL database from our application hosted in the Microsoft Azure cloud. So let's discuss authentication options or methods that we have in the SQL database in the Azure cloud. So we can use Microsoft Entra only authentication. So then the access is secure only with Microsoft Entra ID. There is also an option to use SQL and Microsoft Entra authentication. So to use both or to only use SQL authentication. However, the recommended method is to use Microsoft Entra only authentication. So let's discuss those different methods here and then let's see it in practice. So when accessing SQL database with SQL authentication, obviously we need to have username and password. And when we construct the connection string to access this database, we have to provide this username and the password in the connection string. So from the security perspective, it's not I would say not the best option to do it, especially that, like sometimes from a developer perspective, we can include this connection string in some JSON settings files, or we can unfortunately commit it to the Git repo. So there can be really a big problem with such approach. But of course, it's doable. Sometimes there is a need to use this approach where you don't have a managed identity option. So it's still here for you. However, as I mentioned, the better option is to use Microsoft Entra ID authentication and also managed identities. So let's talk about this more secure approach to connect to the Azure SQL database. So first of all, as I mentioned before, use Microsoft Entra authentication for SQL database and use managed identities. And as you remember from my previous videos, if you didn't watch them, I strongly recommend to watch them. You should already know that we can use managed identities, we can use RBAC roles to access different kinds of services. And with this approach, we don't have to hard code any secrets, keys, credentials in our source code. So let's talk about this scenario here. So there is a managed identity, and as you remember, this can be user-assigned managed identity, it can be system-assigned managed identity, but the thing is that we have this managed identity enabled for the resource in the Azure cloud, like for Azure Container App, for instance, where we host our API. And on the database side, we have those different roles and permissions, okay? So basically, those are the fixed database roles you probably know in the SQL Server. So DB Data Reader, DB Data Writer, DB Access Admin, and so on and so forth. So we have those different roles. And actually, the thing is that we can assign those roles from the SQL database to manage identities created in the Azure cloud. So with this approach, instead of using connection string with username and password, we can use managed identity, and this managed identity will be allowed to execute specific operations in the database based on the role that is assigned to this managed identity. Perfect. So that's about the theory. Now I would like to show you this in practice. So let's see it. So here is the Azure portal and all the Azure resources I created for this solution architecture. As we can see, here is the SQL Server along with the SQL database created. Let me start with the SQL Server configuration. Under the settings here, you can see that we have Microsoft Entra ID section. And for this SQL Server, I configured support for only Microsoft Entra authentication. So as you can see, it means that only Microsoft Entra ID will be used to authenticate to the server. SQL authentication will be disabled, including SQL Server administrators and users. So it means that to access the server databases, you will have to use Microsoft Entra, either user account or Managed Identity, as we will see in this video. So as you remember, we have those three options to set up authentication in SQL Server. It can be Entra ID, it can be both Entra ID and SQL Server authentication, and it can be only SQL authentication. In this case, I want to make it more secure, so that's why I selected Microsoft Entra authentication only. One thing is that, as you can see, I have to set administrator for this SQL Server, okay? And important thing is that please note that admin name here is like this: Secure Cloud App SQL Admins, okay? And you can ask, okay, what's going on here? Is it like Entra user or security group? What's that? So actually, you have two options when you configure authentication for SQL Server. I mean, like administrator for SQL Server, to be more precise. You can either indicate a specific Entra user to be an administrator for this SQL Server, or if you plan to have more administrators, you can create security group in Microsoft Entra ID, add members to this security group, and then set this security group as administrator for this SQL Server. And this is exactly what I did. So I have security group in my Microsoft Entra ID tenant, which is used to secure my Azure subscriptions and this SQL Server access. And all the people in this security group will have admin rights to access this server. Perfect. So that's about the SQL authentication and how to set up an admin here and how to make sure that we will use only Microsoft Entra to make this access more secure. So now let me switch to Visual Studio to see what's going on in the source code, and let's discuss things around connection strings. Great. So here is the Visual Studio, and now let's talk how to integrate with such SQL Server and SQL database where we have Microsoft Entra only authentication enabled. So this can be tricky from a developer perspective, because typically what we do is we use connection string, there is some username and password, we have some permissions in the database assigned, or roles to be more precise, and that's it. But however, we want to make our solution more secure, so we want to eliminate using any username, passwords in the connection strings, because for instance, we don't want to accidentally push this configuration to the Git repository. So let's start with Document API, which is integrated with this SQL database to retrieve information about the documents that were scanned by Document Intelligence Service. So under dependency injection here, I have data service collection extensions. An important fact is that, first of all, I have to load SQL database configuration. So this configuration contains only one property, connection string. Okay, so you can ask, Daniel, it's weird because we said that we want to avoid connection strings. However, in case of SQL database, we cannot avoid connection strings. However, we want to make their structure more secure, and in this video, I will show you how. So we will avoid using username and passwords in those connection strings. So connection string is here actually, and once SQL database configuration is loaded to this class, as you can see, to the instance of this class. Here, I'm using the standard method add db context. So in this case, let me click here, manage NuGet packages. So obviously here, under NuGet packages, you can see that I have Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server package, because I want to integrate my application with SQL database. So as we can see, I'm adding DB context here, document DB context, and also I'm passing the connection string here. And obviously I'm registering invoice repository here, like to get all the invoices for a specific user from the database. Okay, so now the question is, how actually I can securely connect to this SQL database. So let me switch to Visual Studio Code to show you a couple of things there. Okay, so typically when you work with databases from the local machine, obviously you can create your local instance of SQL database without any connection to the cloud. It's your local instance, and as you can see, this is the connection string to connect to the local DB. So Microsoft SQL Server local DB, and it's on my computer. So this is the connection string that I'm using to connect to the database that is actually on my local computer. And that's great. That's like a typical approach, but sometimes there is a need to test something directly with the SQL database hosted in the Azure cloud. And you know, like there can be a situation where you share some SQL database and some tables and data among different developers in the cloud, in the Azure cloud, on development environment. So it means that instead of, you know, like creating databases locally, each developer can connect to the database, SQL database, hosted in the Azure cloud on the development environment. So in this case, we will have to somehow connect to this SQL database, okay? Just to test it, just to push some data there, retrieve some data. So let me open this second tab here, okay? And as we can see here, I have connection string. However, please note that if I will show you authentication mode here, it's Active Directory default. You don't see any username and password here. You see, there is no username, no password, because we use actually Microsoft Azure authentication only. So with this phrase here, authentication Active Directory default, we are indicating that we want to securely connect to the SQL Server and database using Microsoft Azure account. And this connection string you see here, this is the connection string that I'm using when I'm working with the database on my local machine, and this database is in the Azure cloud. So I want to authenticate using my developer account. So again, as you remember, if you watch my previous videos, if you did not, I strongly recommend doing this, because there I explain concept of managed identities, RBAC roles, security groups, role assignments, and so on. The thing is that my developer account is in the Microsoft Azure ID directory, which is used to secure Azure subscriptions and also Azure resources like SQL Server and SQL databases. So it means that I can use my developer account to, first of all, authenticate, to sign in with Microsoft Azure ID and then access SQL database. Okay, so this is about the connection string, as you can see. So this is connection string that is used when I work with my code, but I want to connect to the SQL database using my Microsoft Azure ID account, developer account. But in this specific scenario, you can ask, hey, Daniel, how it's possible? Like how this database will actually know that you know, like you have specific permissions and so on and so forth. So this is what I mentioned in my presentation. As you remember, I mentioned that we can assign different database roles to manage identities, but also we can do the same for users in Microsoft Azure ID, okay? So let me switch to the third tab and let me explain what's going on here, okay? So before any user in Microsoft Azure ID can access specific SQL database and do specific things in this database, this user has to be registered in the database, has to be created in the database. And now, obviously, the thing is that there are like different concepts how we can create those users in the SQL database. So obviously, one of those options is to create a login in the master database. So such person will be able to connect to different databases hosted on the SQL Server. But also the more secure method is to create something what is called contained database user. So with contained database user isn't connected to a login in the master database actually. So in this specific scenario, user is only contained in the specific SQL database. So it means that, let's look at this example here. As you can see here, I have create user adrian@contoso.com from external provider. This line will actually create contain user in the SQL database I want to connect to. And obviously, to execute this command has to be executed by administrator of the SQL server. So that's why we started with administrator configuration, because I wanted to explain this concept first. So then now we understand that to make it possible for other users to connect to the SQL database, we have to actually create accounts for them in the database. So this is how we create contain database user for Entra ID user account. So here I can replace this email address actually with my developer account email address that I use in my organization. And basically, once this user is created here, I can use alter role, so I can assign different roles to this user. So as you can see here, what I can do actually, here I should replace this one with this code here, app member, like this. The second one is for managed identity, we will explain it in a minute. But here, as we can see in the default schema, which is DBO, I'm assigning data reader and data writer role to this contain user. Okay, so this user from Entra ID. So it means that now when I will use my account, developer account in the Visual Studio, I will be able to securely connect to this SQL database and like read data and also write data. So this is very important, and as you remember in my previous videos, I mentioned that you can sign in the Visual Studio with your developer account, and you can also select subscriptions. So let me show you that once again, so we are on the same page how to actually connect with developer account. So here is Visual Studio again, and if I select tools and options, and when I will select here, I have to find, it was called, let me find it really quickly, Azure Service Authentication. You can see that here is account selection section, and here I can actually sign in with my developer account. I can also filter out different directories in Microsoft Entra ID, and I can sign in. So with this configuration here, once I'm authenticated, I can successfully connect to SQL database from my local machine. So as you remember, in the connection string, I don't have username and password. I have this information that I want to use my Entra ID account. Perfect. So that's about local development. Now let's explain how actually we can securely connect to the database when we use managed identities. So here is the Azure portal again. And as you remember, if you watched my previous videos, I created user-assigned managed identity that is used with my Azure Containers apps. So with Document API and with File Upload API, okay? So those two Containers apps are using user-assigned managed identity, which is here. Let me open that really quickly. As you can see here, I have my client ID of the user-assigned managed identity. This is important information because I will show you how we use this client ID in the connection string to connect securely to SQL database using managed identities. So now let me switch to Azure App Configuration. So as you remember, Azure App Configuration is a service where I can centrally store configuration for my application hosted in the Microsoft Azure cloud. And as you can see here, I have Document API config, SQL database config, connection string. Let me show you actually what's inside. So let's take a look at the value property here. Let me actually, let me do it like this. Let me enlarge this, perfect. So now what's going on here? As we can see, connection string looks pretty the same. Like I'm saying that I want to connect to this secure cloud app SQL database. I have to specify default catalog database. However, important thing is that under authentication, instead of username and password, again, important information, I have Active Directory Managed Identity. And obviously, Active Directory should be replaced with Entra ID, probably in the future. At least at the moment of recording this video, it's Active Directory Managed Identity, okay? So just for you to know. So in this case, I'm saying, okay, for the authentication, use Active Directory Managed Identity. And please note that here, I have to provide the user ID, which is the client ID of my user assigned managed identity, which I use with my Azure Containers apps. So it means that when I deploy my ASP.NET Core API to Azure Containers apps, because of the fact that Azure Container App has managed identity enabled, this user assigned managed identity enabled, I will be able to successfully connect to this SQL database because I have to provide this client ID of user assigned managed identity in the connection string. Okay. However, that's not enough. Like, this is about the connection string, okay? To make our application more secure, no usernames, passwords, and so on and so forth. However, in the same way as we created contained database user for standard Entra user, we have to also create this contained database user for our managed identity. So let me switch to Visual Studio Code to show you that. Okay, so here is Visual Studio Code, and as you remember, that was the code that we used to create contained database user for our Entra ID developer account. However, here in this section, we have to create contained database user for our managed identity. And it's simple as that. Like, we have to use this command, create user. Here we have to provide the name of our user assigned managed identity. So this is exactly the same name that I use for my managed identity in the Azure portal. From external provider here with default schema DBO. And here I have to use alter role with data reader and data writer. And I'm adding the member, and member is this managed identity. So once I execute this command in the database, obviously I have to be authenticated as administrator, so administrator has to do it. This contained database user will be created, and this user assigned managed identity will be able to connect to this specific SQL database. So as I mentioned before, contained database users do not have a login in the master database. With contained database users, we can create users that will only access specific databases on the SQL server. So you have this option, you can read more about it, but like to keep our application more secure, if we have one SQL database server and one database actually, it can be a good idea to create contained database users here, okay? So those users will be only created in the target SQL database. Perfect. So as we can see, with this piece of code, we will be able to assign those two permissions, and then in the end, our application will be able to successfully connect to SQL database without any usernames, passwords, and will be able to read and write the data. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. In the next video, we are going to talk about secure deployments from Azure DevOps to the Azure Cloud. So I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.